All right, well, so far in this series, we have ranked 31 visualizations, running the full gamut from the glorious S tiers to the basement-dwelling F tiers. We've ranked the most basic visualizations and variants that are far too complex for their own good. But all of these visualizations have one common feature. They're built for small data. Now, when I say small data, I don't just mean the number of samples, right? A histogram is perfectly comfortable swallowing up 1 million plus data points, provided that all of those data points are only for one variable. While I've called this category of visualizations big data, perhaps I really should have called it wide data, as these plots all aim to convey not just many data points, but also the relationship between many variables. Semantics aside, let's go make our drink. Naturally, I thought the drink pairing for big data had to be a tiki drink, right? Lots of ingredients, lots of volume, just sort of fit really well. So this tiki drink is going to be a riff on a classic called a Crane Kick. I chose the Crane Kick because it is a whiskey-based tiki drink, which is relatively rare. There's not a huge number of them out there. And so obviously whiskey-based, we are going to start off with 2 ounces of our rye once more. Then we are going to add 1 teaspoon of Scotch for a little bit of smokiness, 2 teaspoons of Malibu, 1 ounce of Passionfruit Juice, half an ounce of lemon juice, half an ounce of Orgeat, and finally, to top it off, 1 dash of Angostura Bitters. All right, we're gonna give this a good shake. And strain that into our hurricane glass with a whole bunch of crushed ice in there. And then because I'm feeling fancy, I'm gonna garnish this thing with a cute little cocktail umbrella. All right, so this is my little variant on the Crane Kick. Let's give it a try. Ooh. Whoa, that's a really interesting cocktail. Okay. That is kind of everything I really like about tiki drinks. There's a lot of different flavors, all kind of coming in and out in this very chaotic, yet very sort of cohesive manner. Like sort of right up front, you get a bit of that sort of, rye, whiskey, oaky sort of, smoke, burn flavor. But then right away, that sort of morphs into the much peatier notes from our Scotch, but then those immediately give away to the coconut from the Malibu, which sort of fades into the passion fruit from the passion fruit juice. And then the whole time, all of these flavors are doing the really weird things. You have the Orgeat lending it this sort of really nice creaminess and sort of a consistency there. Damn, this is a really good tiki drink. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. Yeah, that's an S tier drink right there, goddamn. All right, I'm loving this one. All right, let's get into the visualizations. All right, now first up on big data is the pair plot. And the pair plot, in my opinion, is S tier with one very important caveat. So the pair plot is only S tier if you're using the diagonal version of it, all right? If you're using the full square matrix, it drops down to like B tier probably. And the reason it drops so many tiers is just because there's way too much redundancy when you have the full square. Literally, the top is the same as the bottom. You don't need to be using all of that extra ink and extra space to just, have the same information presented twice. It truly is the absolute workhorse though, when you're doing that initial data exploration, right? When you have to sort of like sort through this really big data set and sort of identify some initial promising connections between variables. That is really where the pair plot shines. And it's so good at that. It gives you so much insight into the data in such a clean and concise manner. I love it. It's S tier easily in my books. Next one is very similar. It's the correlation matrix plot. The correlation matrix plot is basically just a simplified pair plot. So instead of actually showing the data, as these little scatter plots for each of them, instead it just sort of gives you, a number or a color corresponding to what the correlation is between those, right? So you've basically simplified it down from the dots to just a single figure for it. Now, me personally, I prefer having that extra detail of the pair plot, but there's certainly a case to be made for the correlation matrix, and the two aren't mutually exclusive, right? You can have them right next to each other, and that can actually make it really easy to kind of, just back up the intuition that you get from one of them, or to double check, the simple number of the correlation matrix versus the detail of the pair plot. So In my books, it is A tier because it's not quite as good as the pair plot. It is missing a little bit of detail, but it is still very good at sort of getting that initial, gut check what relationships are going to be important, which ones aren't, from your data. And again, same caveat as the pair plot. You should only use the diagonal version of this. There's no need to use the full redundant square matrix. Next up is the Hexbin Plot. And I went back and forth on whether the Hexbin Plot belongs here in big data or under the scatterplot variants. There's really an argument to be made for either of them, but at least in the cases I've seen for utilizing a Hexbin plot, it's typically when you have just such a quantity of data that if you tried to plot them as points, the points would just stack on top of each other, like to a degree where it would basically just be a black blob on the page. And so as a result, you sort of color the density in of your plot to give you a sense that to visualize the shared distribution of those two variables. I think this is one where in its base form, where it's just that sort of Hexbin scatterplot type distribution, it's an A tier. It's sort of good at showing that distribution, but it's just a little bit lacking in detail. I think this becomes an S tier visualization if you add the marginal distributions on top and to the side. So, on top of the chart to the side, that way you can sort of see the distribution of each of the variables on its own, and then you can also get that sort of shared distribution. Continuing on, we have the heat matrix, which is, again, very similar to things like the correlation matrix, really good for sort of getting an initial gut check on the connections between a whole bunch of variables. You're a little bit short on the actual information being conveyed. A lot of times at the end of the day, these are basically just tables when you really get down to it, they're sort of color-coded tables. And also, because of just the amount of different factors that you have, different variables that you have on these usually, they often really need to be interactive in order to sort of be easily accessible, right? Otherwise, they just sort of get too big, too unwieldy. You need the ability to sort of filter or highlight sections in order for these to really be, sort of S tier type visualizations. The other sort of reason that they're A tier, not S tier, is because these really come down to what color chart or color bar you pick for visualizing it. If you choose a poor color scale for this kind of heat map, it can be just like completely incomprehensible. That is something that generally requires sort of active thought to do poorly, but certainly it can be very easy to have one that, to a colorblind audience is just completely unreadable. You have colors blurring together and appearing too close. So between those two, I think it goes in A. Again, still very good at sort of conveying these large number of relationships, but just a few too many pitfalls to really be an S tier. All right, next up is the packed circle chart. The packed circle chart is just a tree map, which is our next visualization, that sucks. As we've talked about with pie charts, humans don't do the size of circles well. They do the size of boxes well. So why would you do a chart that takes all of the boxes of a tree map and turns them into circles, right? And now additionally, circles also don't pack well. So instead of having a sort of perfectly rectangular packed in tree map, you now have a bunch of circles with varying degrees of white space between all of them, which sort of further muddies the visual picture when you're trying to actually draw conclusions from this visualization. It's not F tier because it's not like offensively bad, it's just regular bad. It's just not very good at the job it's trying to do, but at the end of the day, it's not gonna like make me want to gouge my eyes out or anything. It's just gonna make me sigh really deeply. And so as a result, packed circle chart goes into D tier. All right, and then finally, our last of the big data visualizations, that tree map that I just mentioned. This, in my opinion, is how you do hierarchical relationships correctly, right? And it's especially good when you have a lot of different entries that you need to convey their hierarchical relationships. You've probably seen these most often on stock market visualizations. They're really good for sort of showing how different sectors are performing, right? Because in the stock market, you have the sort of two very clean colors of price go up, price go down. You can adjust, the shading of them based on the amount of up or amount of down. But as a result, you can sort of very quickly at a glance be like, okay, this industry block of the stock market is green and it's going up. this block is red and going down, and then sort of within those blocks, you can look at individual companies and be like, okay, here's how Microsoft or whatever is doing. I do think it's not quite S tier because these tend to prioritize pure information over really conveying a story, right? They're kind of glorified tables at the end of the day, but it's still very clean, it's still very effective. It's just, it's missing a little bit of that sauce in terms of like cleanly conveying, here is the takeaway from this visualization. Much more sort of a just general, yeah, you know, here's the picture kind of thing. Maybe that's just my own personal bias creeping through, but Treemap is going in A tier, which is actually where most of the big data visualizations have gone. That's a pretty solid category. There's not a lot of really poor options, surprisingly, for how challenging, you know, visualizing a lot of data is. I'm going to finish this and then we'll be on to the next.